Ferdinand the Second of Aragon. Ferdinand the Second built Spain from scratch, stitching Castile and Aragon together through marriage, war, and ruthless political calculation, and then was arguably killed by his own desperation for an heir. After Isabella died in 1504, he took a young second wife, Germaine de Foix, who according to widely repeated contemporary accounts began giving him potions to boost his virility and produce a male heir for Aragon. The suspected ingredient was cantharides, Spanish fly, believed in small doses to act as an aphrodisiac, but in larger or repeated doses it causes severe kidney damage, internal bleeding, and cardiovascular strain. Whether the potions accelerated his decline or he was simply aging badly is debated. But the deterioration of his final years was dramatic and visible to his court. He collapsed while traveling towards Seville and was taken to Madrigalejo, a remote village in Extremadura, not a palace, not a city, just a stopping point on a road through one of Spain's emptiest landscapes. He died there on January 23, 1516, at 63, in an unremarkable building entirely unworthy of the man who had funded Columbus, expelled the Jews and Moors, and laid the foundations of the largest empire the world had yet seen. His grandson Charles inherited everything. Philip I of Castile, the Handsome. Philip I reigned fewer than 4 months as King of Castile in 1506. He was 28, physically vigorous, strikingly handsome by all accounts, and had just wrested Castile from his father-in-law Ferdinand through political maneuvering and his wife Joanna's claim to the throne. Then, on September 25, 1506, after a strenuous game of pelota in the summer heat, he drank a large quantity of cold water and developed a fierce fever within days. He was dead within 2 weeks. The cause is usually given as typhoid, though some suggest plague, and, given that a young king had just displaced the formidable Ferdinand, there were unsubstantiated whispers of poison. His already fragile wife, Joanna, reportedly refused to be separated from his coffin for months, accompanying it on a long, strange journey across Castile, a vigil over his decomposing body that became a defining legend of her descent into what contemporaries called madness. His death handed Ferdinand back the regency he had just lost. Joanna I of Castile, Joanna the Mad. Joanna was Queen of Castile from 1504 until her death in 1555, but spent 46 of those years confined at the castle of Tordesillas, while first her father Ferdinand and then her son Charles ruled in her name, under the pretense of her incapacity. Whether she was genuinely ill, historians have suggested severe depression, schizophrenia, or simply a grieving, isolated woman pathologized for political convenience. She was kept from power for nearly half a century in conditions of increasing deprivation. In her final years, she refused to eat regularly, refused a proper bed, and became intensely focused on religious observance. She died on April 12, 1555 at 75 on Good Friday, a detail contemporaries found spiritually significant. She never exercised a single day of actual power. 46 years in one castle, and then nothing. Charles I of Spain. Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Charles I voluntarily walked away from the largest empire in the world and then spent his retirement slowly dying in a monastery. He abdicated in 1556, dividing his territories between his son Philip and his brother Ferdinand, and retreated to the monastery of Yuste in Extremadura, the same bleak region where his grandfather Ferdinand had died 40 years earlier. By then his body was wrecked. Gout had attacked him since his 30s. His fingers were too swollen to grip a pen, his knees too painful to bend, and he was carried everywhere in a specially designed chair. At Yuste he did not live the austere life mythology suggests. He ate enormously. Kept a large household and followed European politics obsessively, but his body collapsed regardless. Worsened by recurring fevers believed to have been malaria. He died on September 21, 1558, at 58. Reportedly holding the same crucifix his wife Isabella had held at her death, having spent his final days rehearsing his own funeral. The man who had ruled from Vienna to Peru and faced down Martin Luther died in a monk's cell, more or less exactly what he had asked for. Philip II's death was extraordinarily agonizing, and it happened to a man of 71. He ruled for 42 years from El Escorial, the vast granite palace monastery he built north of Madrid, and chose to die there in a small monk's cell beside the chapel so he could hear mass from his bed. The illness that killed him lasted some 53 documented days and involved severe gout, dropsy, and massively infected bed sores spreading across his body. Attendants cut holes in his mattress to drain the wounds. Moving him caused screams of pain, so he lay in his own waste for extended periods, because turning him hurt more. His body had essentially begun decomposing around him while he stayed conscious. And yet by multiple accounts he faced it with remarkable composure, receiving last rites with full awareness and reportedly voicing no complaint. He died on September 13, 1598, in the smallest, simplest room of the greatest palace in the world, Philip III. Philip III's death comes with one of the stranger anecdotes of any European monarch. According to widely cited accounts, he sat in a room dangerously overheated by a nearby brazier. The one official permitted to move it was absent. Fit and etiquette forbade anyone else from touching it, so Philip endured the heat rather than have protocol violated. Whether that incident caused his illness or merely worsened one, he developed erysipelas, a bacterial skin infection that left his face fiery red and swollen, with high fever and rapid deterioration. He died on March 31, 1621, at only 42. His reign had been run largely by his favorite, the Duke of Lerma. In death as in life, Philip III is half a bystander in his own story. Philip IV. Philip IV reigned for 44 years and watched Spain come apart around him. Portugal broke away in 1640. Catalonia rebelled. The Dutch held their independence. The military dominance that had defined Spain for a century visibly crumbled. And Philip, personally intelligent, a genuine patron who funded Velázquez, aged dramatically under the weight of it. Portraits from his 30s show a vigorous, sharp-faced king. By his late 50s, the same face has hollowed into something exhausted and gray. He died on September 17, 1665 at 60, from recurring fevers, dropsy, and what physicians called general physical collapse. The throne passed to his son, Charles II, whose catastrophic condition was the direct consequence of the Habsburgs' century-long commitment to marrying their own relatives. Philip IV's death is in many ways the death of Habsburg Spain. Charles II, the Bewitched. Charles II is almost certainly the most physically devastated monarch in Spanish history, and his condition was not nature's accident, but deliberate dynastic policy. The Habsburgs had married cousins, aunts, nieces, and uncles for generations to keep power in the family. Charles's parents were uncle and niece, and his inbreeding coefficient has been calculated as higher than that of a child of two full siblings. The results were devastating from birth. An enormous protruding jaw that left him unable to chew properly and drooling throughout his life. Chronic diarrhea, epileptic episodes, an inability to walk until age 8, probable hormonal deficiencies, and cognitive impairments severe enough that he was considered ungovernable. Expected to die in childhood, he lived to 38. He died on November 1, 1700, All Saints' Day. An autopsy reportedly found his organs in severe deterioration. A tiny heart, a blackened testicle, a skull full of fluid, rotting intestines. Findings some historians question, but which read like an inventory of what extreme inbreeding costs. His airless death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, killing hundreds of thousands across Europe. Philip V, the first Bourbon king, arrived from France at 17. He appears to have suffered from severe bipolar disorder, and the retroactive evidence is unusually compelling. His depressive episodes were total. He refused to change his clothes for months, refused to sign state documents, believed himself dying of imaginary illnesses, lay motionless in bed for weeks. 5 and at his worst was essentially catatonic, leaving his wife Elizabeth Farnese as de facto ruler. The famous intervention of the castrato Farinelli is one of history's strangest medical treatments. He joined the court in 1737 and sang the same 4 songs to Philip every night for years, apparently the only thing that could reliably pull the king back toward functionality. Philip abdicated in 1724 in favor of his son Louis, then was forced back onto the throne 7 months later when Louis died of smallpox. He died on July 9, 1746, at 62, from a convulsive episode, likely representing a stroke. Farinelli reportedly kept singing for the next king regardless, Louis I. Louis I is the shortest reigning monarch in Spanish history, 7 months and 10 days. He took the throne from his abdicating father in January 1724 at 16, and was dead by August 31 at 17. The cause was smallpox, which produced fever, agonizing skin eruptions, and gradual respiratory failure. Louis was young and considered healthy, but smallpox killed roughly 30% of those it infected regardless of condition. His death forced Philip V, who had abdicated specifically to escape the burden of kingship, to return to the throne Ferdinand VI. Ferdinand VI's death can be attributed, without much exaggeration, to grief. He had been genuinely devoted to his wife Barbara of Braganza, unusual in an 18th-century monarch, and when she died of tuberculosis in August 1758, his response was complete disintegration. He stopped eating properly, refused a bed for the floor, abandoned all government business, and wandered the gardens of the palace of Villaviciosa de Odon at night, crying and screaming for hours. Contemporary accounts suggest he shared the underlying mental illness that had afflicted his father Philip V, and Barbara's death simply removed the stabilizing force that kept him functional. He deteriorated over the following 11 months, and died on August 10, 1759 at 46. He had no children, so the throne passed to his half-brother, Charles III, a man who found one person worth living for, and did not manage to survive her by a year. Charles III. Charles III is frequently called the best king Spain ever had. He was 72, had reigned 29 years, had pushed through significant administrative reforms across the empire, expelled the Jesuits, reorganized colonial governance, and kept Spain genuinely relevant in Europe. He had also been, his whole adult life, an obsessive and physically vigorous hunter, walking miles daily in a disciplined outdoor routine contemporaries credited for his longevity. Then, in December 1788, he developed a severe cold that deteriorated rapidly into what physicians called catarrhal fever, almost certainly influenza, possibly pneumonia, and was dead within days, on December 14, 1788, in Madrid. Charles III was the last Spanish monarch capable of projecting confident, reform-minded authority. What came after was his son Charles IV, then Napoleon, then the long unraveling of everything he had tried to build, Charles IV. Charles IV did not die in Spain, on a throne, or anywhere near the apparatus of royal power. He died in Naples on January 20, 1819, as a pensioner of foreign courts, having surrendered his kingdom to Napoleon 11 years earlier. The abdications of Bayonne in 1808 saw Charles and his son Ferdinand coerced into handing the crown to Napoleon's brother Joseph. Transaction achieved through Napoleon's pressure, Charles's weakness, Talt V, and the dysfunctional relationship between father and son that had already destabilized the court. Charles spent his remaining years moving between Rome and Naples on subsidies, a former king living in other people's palaces. He died at 70, likely from cardiovascular or pulmonary illness. His death barely registered in a Spain that had since fought a war of independence, proclaimed and suspended a liberal constitution, and begun losing its American colonies. Ferdinand VII. Ferdinand VII was called the Desired when he returned from French captivity in 1813, and the Traitor King by liberals within a few years, both nicknames accurate. He abolished the Constitution twice, executed liberals, and ruled with a reactionary stubbornness that made every crisis worse. He had suffered from gout for years, and in his final weeks developed severe dropsy, his limbs and abdomen swelling massively as his organs failed under the pressure. He died on September 29, 1833, at 48. Just before his death, he had confirmed the Pragmatic Sanction, allowing his infant daughter Isabella to inherit ahead of his brother Don Carlos, who immediately rejected it, launching the First Carlist War within weeks of the burial. Spain spent the next several decades consumed by Carlist conflicts, liberal-conservative struggles, and the slow collapse of its American empire. Isabella II. Isabella II reigned from infancy, was deposed at 38, and died at 73 in Paris. Her reign from 1833 to 1868 was a 35-year argument between liberals and conservatives, Carlists and constitutionalists, military factions and palace intrigues. A queen whose personal life drew constant scandal and whose political judgment almost everyone, supporters included, considered unreliable. The Glorious Revolution of 1868 sent her into exile in France, and in 1870 she abdicated in favor of her son, the future Alfonso XII. She spent 3 decades in Paris as a historical figure rather than a political one, watching from afar as Spain passed through the First Republic The Restoration ends the loss of Cuba and the Philippines. She died on April 9, 1904, from complications of influenza and bronchitis. She was already history before she died. Alfonso XII. Alfonso XII died at 27. Restored to the throne in 1874 after the chaotic failure of the First Republic, he had a short reign that was genuinely promising. He was politically moderate, personally popular, and represented a stability Spain had not known in decades. He was also already dying. Tuberculosis had likely been developing for years before it became impossible to ignore, progressing through the lungs with persistent coughing, night sweats, dramatic weight loss, and the slow suffocation of a body that could no longer get enough oxygen. Alfonso deteriorated visibly through 1885 and died on November 25, 1885, at El Pardo Palace outside Madrid. What made his death particularly poignant was the memory of his first wife, Mercedes of Orleans, whom he had loved deeply, and who had died of typhoid just 5 months after their 1878 wedding. He had remarried for political necessity, leaving behind his second wife, Maria Cristina, pregnant at his death. Their son, born the following May, would be Alfonso XIII, a king inheriting a role from a father he never met, Alfonso XIII. Alfonso XIII was the last king of Spain before the Republic. He was born king. His father had died 6 months before his birth, and spent his whole reign as the symbol of a perpetually contested monarchy. He survived multiple assassination attempts, the most dramatic on his wedding day, May 31, 1906, when the anarchist Mateo Morral threw a bomb hidden in a bouquet at the royal carriage in Madrid. More than 20 people were killed and dozens wounded. Alfonso and his new wife, Victoria Eugenie, escaped with their wedding clothes, covered in the blood of those around them. He reigned through World War I, the Rif War, and the dictatorship of Primo de Rivera, until April 1931, when municipal election results made clear Spain had turned against the monarchy. He left the country without formally abdicating, insisting he was not abandoning his throne, but temporarily stepping aside to avoid civil bloodshed, a distinction he maintained in exile for the rest of his life. He lived in Rome through the 1930s, watching the Spanish Civil War destroy the country he had ruled. 2 days before his death, he formally renounced his rights to the throne in favor of his son Juan. He died on February 28, 1941, at 54, in his room at the Grand Hotel in Rome from angina pectoris. Outside the hotel windows, Rome was at war. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.